This next seam is a Hong Kong seam finish. We're going to have a 1.5 seam allowance. We're going to drop our needle down into the fabric, sewing a couple of stitches and then back tacking and staying with the 1.5 seam allowance the whole length of the fabric. Just slowing down when you're nearly at the end and back tacking for the last 2 to 3 stitches. Lifting up the needle and the presser foot and cutting our threads. Our sample is now ready to take to the ironing board to press into place. We're now going to take our sample and press open our seam allowance. We've got a 1.5. Just going to manoeuvre it with our fingers and then place the iron over the seam so it's nice and flat. Turn it to the right side of the fabric and repress over the seam. The next step is to prepare our bias strips. So we have a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance, and we're now going to need 2 pieces of bias that we've cut at a 2.5 centimetre. So we're now going to press them flat to prepare them ready to be sewn on to our seam allowance. Okay, that's all of our pieces ready to be taken to the sewing machine to sew on to the next step. So we're now going to take our bias strip, right sides together, onto our seam. Just pushing the garment back to the other side. So the only thing that we'll be machining is right sides together of the seam allowance to the bias binding. We're now going to measure a 0.5 of a centimetre seam allowance, position that under our needle, drop the presser foot, and we're going to start sewing for the whole length of our seam. Just keeping in mind that you need to make sure that the edge of the bias stays directly on top of the seam below. So just sewing 2 to 3 stitches, back tacking, and sewing down the length of the seam. Just keep to your 0.5. You need to readjust it just before you get to the end. And then back tack for the last 2 to 3 stitches. Lifting up the needle and the presser foot, you can cut your threads. So now we're going to turn it back the other way. And we're going to put right sides together on the other side of the seam allowance. So pushing the garment or the sample to the left so that the only thing that you'll be sewing on is the bias binding and the seam allowance below. So once again, you're going to make a measurement of 0.5 centimetres. That's going to become our seam allowance. So dropping our needle down, just rethread that. So dropping the needle down, we're going to back tack for the first 2 to 3 stitches and continue down the whole length of the seam allowance with a 0.5 centimetre seam. So just slowing down at the end there, making sure that our bias is level with our seam underneath. Back tacking 2 to 3 stitches, lifting the needle up, the presser foot goes up, and cutting your threads. Okay, so let's have a look at what our sample looks like so far. So this is the wrong side of the sample. We've now attached 2 strips of bias binding with a 0.5 centimetre seam allowance. And what we're going to do is take it to the iron and press under our seam allowance, ready to stitch into place. When we take our iron, what we're going to do is press our bias right along that seam to make it nice and flat. We're going to turn our sample around and press the bias flat on the other side. We're then going to open it up and trim the seam allowance and the bias back to 3 millimetres. This will help us turn the bias binding over the edge and tuck it and stitch it into place. So just cut that as straight as you can, because that's going to make our seam nice and straight. So you're only cutting the bias tape and the seam allowance, and you're cutting it back to 3 millimetres. Okay, let's have a look. Okay, so just iron it flat again. Now I'm going to start with the right side first. And we're now going to press under the bias tape. Three millimetres. Quite a narrow turn, so it's quite tricky. You want to keep it as straight as possible, so just adjust it if you need to. I'm going to take some pins, open it back up, and roll it under. I'll just pin it in place and then I'll show you what it's meant to look like underneath. Okay, so there's the top of our seam finish, and when we roll it under, we have a 3 millimetre turn which has been extended so that we can stitch in the ditch the whole length of that seam. We'll just continue to roll it. So what you're pinning through is the seam itself and catching the underneath of the bias binding. Now we're just going to do exactly the same on the other side by pressing under our seam allowance, 3 millimetres, and then we're going to pin it into place around that seam. So just pushing our sample to the side and flipping it so that we can turn it. And then just securing it with some pins. Where we'll stitch in the ditch along the length of the seam allowance. And just that last little bit, tuck that under. Okay, so there is our open 1.5 centimetre seam. We've got 2 pieces of bias tape that have been machined on. They've been pressed and pinned into place. And now we're about to take it over to the sewing machine and stitch in the ditch along the line there to secure the bind on the top and the bottom.